This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hey everybody, thank you for coming to the third this semester of our Centre for Studies of Home seminar series. And it's with great pleasure that I'm introducing today Dr. Katie Beswick, who is lecturer in drama at the University of Exeter, having held previous positions at Queen Mary most recently and Leeds, as well as having been a housing officer in Hackney and a facilitator of applied and community theatre. And her research focuses particularly on marginalised spaces, places and people, and issues relating to class, race and inequality in performance work. And she's published widely on performances set and taking place on council estates, and is currently writing a monograph called Social Housing and Performance. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Katie and her paper, The Resident Artist Making Performance on Your Council Estate Home.
Hi, thank you for having me. So for about the past 6 or 7 years, I've been looking at the representation of council estates in theatre particularly, but also across the wider realm of cultural representation, so in film, television, music video and novels. So what I realised yesterday was that the subtitle of this talk, Making Performance in Your Council Estate Home, sort of suggests that this might be a how-to talk, as if I might be telling you how to make performance. So if anyone's here, hello, if anyone's here for that reason, then you're probably going to be disappointed because that's not what this talk is about. So the reason I used the term your home was kind of for more political reasons. So academics such as Beverly Skeggs and Lisa Mackenzie have pointed out that those people who live on social housing estates, what I'm calling council estates for the purposes of this talk, are often demonised and othered both inside and outside of academia. So I'll be more specific about this in a moment and go into a bit more detail. So often in academic writing, residents will be described as they, and the tone of the writing will be as if the writer or speaker presumes that those people listening or reading have no first-hand experience of estates. So the idea is that people like us, educated, perhaps with an interest in the arts and culture, couldn't possibly have first-hand experience of what's perceived to be poor, working class, dangerous environment. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So for me, titling my talk with you in the title was a move to suggest that those listening to my talk will necessarily include people, and I know does include people for whom who do live on estates or have lived on estates or have other first-hand experience of them. So language, what I want to sort of say is remains important, and part of what I'm trying to get across in the talk today is that how we speak about things, how we frame who we want to address in both academic and everyday language, importantly reflects something about who we expect to read and act upon our work. So that what I hope with my research really is that it's read and of interest to estate residents inside academia and beyond, as well as to those outsiders who have an interest in the subject. So the phrase council estate, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, refers to the large-scale social housing projects that have become a feature of the contemporary landscape in the UK, particularly of the urban landscape. So they were originally conceived, designed and built to provide subsidised housing provision for the low-income working classes. I mean, I'm really skimming over the history here, and this history is really complex. So although a lot of estates are no longer rented as social housing, so that there are a lot of estates that aren't rented on behalf of the local council, nonetheless, the term council estate, those spaces are often invoked in discussions about issues such as welfare benefits, and then also in issues about the behaviour of the poor working classes, so in terms of crime and community particularly. So what my research has been really concerned with is thinking about why the term council estate and all it encompasses has such social and political traction in the UK, and how and why the image and identity of estates is secured. What performance practices and other artistic practices might do to challenge stigmatising negative conceptions of estates, and how various conceptions of estates might impact upon the lives of estate residents, and particularly on the lives of the residents that rent their home at a discounted rate, otherwise known as social renters. So if the housing bill goes through, there might be less and less of them. So those who live on what Lisa Mackenzie calls poor council estates are of particular concern to me. So in this way, my research differs from a lot of the existing estate research, which tends to focus either on specific estates and the ways in which they operate, for example, to produce identity, to shape lives of residents, the way that individual estates are governed, or on the conditions of regeneration and its effects on residents living on particular estates or on estates more widely. There's also a large body of material on the history of council estates, on the architecture of estates, and on the policy and governance in the kind of history of social housing. But what my work does that I think is a little bit different is it rests on this premise that there is a generic council estate. So that is, there is an archetype that circulates in popular culture through which the perception, practice and governance of estates by residents and others is shaped. So in other words, what I argue is that in popular culture there is a council estate discourse. So that is, there is an established way of thinking and speaking about estates which secures identity, mostly in negative terms, and limits the way we think about and experience estate spaces. So Michel Foucault used the term discourse to refer to the relationship between knowledge and power. So he presumes that power is controlled by knowledge, and that those who are able to create and contribute to that knowledge hold power, simply. So Foucault's conception of discourse indicates that structural inequalities are partially hinged upon some people or groups having their voices heard and some having them silenced. So in popular contemporary representations of the council estate, residents' voices are often not heard or else selectively used to maintain existing negative conceptions of estate spaces. So in Foucault's model, estate residents are disempowered by their role in the dominant discourse. Okay, so before we move on to the talk, what I want to make really clear, if it's not already, is that when I use the term council estate, I'm mostly referring, unless it's otherwise obvious, as in some of the examples I'll give, to this generic idea of an estate, of this urban inner city estate that circulates in popular culture. So the reality of each estate, of course, is different. And as I've said, because of various policy interventions, including the right to buy, which allowed social renters to buy their homes at a discounted rate, and subsequently allowed the sale of these properties on the private market, these places no longer function as housing only for the poor working classes. Rather, on many estates, there's a diversity of social and economic circumstances amongst residents, and of course there are rural estates as well, which are perhaps different in some ways. We don't actually need the sound, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. So this fact that estates are diverse in a lot of ways has actually yet to properly figure in the dominant discourse around estates. So they're still mainly and not exclusively but majorly perceived and represented as a kind of last resort home for those on low incomes who can't house themselves or any other means. So some common tropes of estate representation, of the construction of this estate in popular representation, can be seen through kind of recent screen examples. And I'll go over some of these now and how I think they illustrate these kind of tropes. So the first representational kind of trope of the council estate is this idea of the council estate as ruin. So Brian Dillon has talked about ruins as sites that function as a reminder of the past, while paradoxically casting us forward in time. So Dillon argues that the ruin predicts a future in which our present will slump into similar disrepair or fall victim to some unforeseeable calamity. So in 21st century Britain, the brutalist social housing estate or council estates, and particularly these modernist examples of estates, serve as archetypal contemporary ruins. The physical space of abandoned housing projects, of once fated tower blocks in the process of demolition, are documented and recalled by visual artists, novelists and theatre makers, continuing a long tradition of Ruinenlust. That's a German term that scholar Rose Macaulay used to describe the fascination with ruin that persisted in literature and art in the modern period. But the term Ruinenlust was kind of bastardised by the Tate in 2014 when they did their Ruinlust exhibition. And within that exhibition there were a lot of contemporary artworks that documented the ruin of estates. But what I've argued is that unlike the iconic ruins of the modern period and also these ruin examples of estates, the estates don't actually have to be depicted in ruin in order to evoke a ruin affect. So what I've argued is that actually just simply by putting an estate by representing an estate, you invoke these discourses of ruin that circulate around kind of welfare benefits and social housing. And I think that this idem, which I'll play, there's a little bit of sound coming out of this computer, but it's not really important because you kind of get the impression just from seeing the image, really. But this is a Channel 4 ident, which you might recognise.
Here on Channel 4 now, it's either all work or all play. Our new series of Wife Swap kicks off with strong language throughout.
So you can kind of see this as kind of this bleak, empty space. It's not actually ruined, you know, there are still people living in it, but it's got these flooded walkways, lots of satellite dishes. It creates this ruin narrative that I think is quite typical in estate representation. So estates are regularly framed as sites of crime and danger in representation. London estates are particularly implicated in discourses surrounding black-on-black gang violence and are often called into play in media rhetoric surrounding large-scale moments of civil unrest. So in the 2011 riots, a lot of the newspaper press co-opted this idea of an estate and of an estate resident to talk about estates. There was an article called "Were Estates to Blame for the Riots" in The Guardian, and lots of others that were like that, even though actually the estates didn't really have very much to do with them. So the council estate is kind of symbolically and conceptually this generic place with this fixed identity that's often invoked in discourses of social ruin and ruination. And kind of related to this social ruin narrative is another kind of common trope of estate representation, which I will talk about a bit more later because it comes a bit more important later on. But this is the idea of the council estate as hood. So this is where the energy of the North American hood, so sociologists Richardson and Scott Meir have conceptualised the North American hood as a global site that's appropriated globally to kind of operationalise this spirit of kind of liberation through cultural representation such as hip hop, and this global hood, this North American hood, is often operationalised through representations of the estate to present the estate and its residents as kind of edgy, hyper-modern, potentially dangerous, again bound up with both positive and kind of negative conceptions of black urban inner city. So this is the trailer from Attack the Block, which was a sci-fi movie set on an estate.
What is that, God? That's an alien, bruv. Believe it, when it landed in the wrong place, or you get wrong place.
You discovered a species hitherto unknown to science.
You kids is ready.
Yo, check it. 15s. Lovely fireworks. Lovely.
It's an invasion.
Of course it is.
I'm killing him straight. Let's get tooled up, blood.
Quite sweet, really, aren't they?
That makes a true criticize me. Right now, I feel like going home, locking my door, and playing FIFA. Oh, that's a feature for me.
So you get the idea. So you have these images that are kind of very similar to some of the images that come out of representations of the urban inner city in America, where with kids with baseball caps speaking in a particular sort of urban dialect, and even though it's kind of very British, there is also something that is speaking to that kind of hood trope, I think, within that particular representation and more widely. So where estate residents are given a voice in popular representations, they're often not in control of that voice. So, and this is this idea again that comes back to what Lisa Mackenzie and Bev Skeggs have argued, that estate residents and poor working classes are often positioned as other to sort of liberal middle class values. So the objectionable or exceptional activities of estate residents are used to suggest that these are people who are lacking in taste, intelligence, values, and kind of very little effort is made to understand residents on their own terms. So this I'm going to show now, and if you can't hear it, I'll repeat some of the stuff that they say, but this is from the Channel 4 series, How to Get a Council House, and it gives some idea of the kind of negative depictions of residents that happens on reality television, which is one of the only places really, particularly on television, where you get to hear the actual voices of estate residents. So we'll just look at this. So she said foreigners get houses like that. Foreigners coming around here and they get houses. So you've got this woman dressed in a sort of tabard, and then it cuts to these sort of quite bleak images of a couple in a tracksuit walking a Staffordshire Terrier. So these are all images that are kind of quite bound up with this idea of the chav, which Owen Jones has written about as the kind of objectionable working class other. So these three tropes are ones that are kind of really common in representations of estates, and there are others, of course, but those are three that I think are really prevalent. So arts practices are often positioned as capable of transforming spaces and ameliorating social problems. And certainly there are numerous arts practices and practitioners who work on estates or do projects on estates and attempt to make a difference by engaging residents in arts activities, providing opportunities and resources for residents to express ideas, challenge dominant perceptions and physically alter the spaces where they live. So these artists often work in residence on the estate, organising projects, collaborating with residents, and are often brought into the estate for projects. So examples of collectives that are kind of permanently based on the estate would be someone like the Drawing Shed in Walthamstow, who do lots of quite exciting arts projects and have been there for some time. So the problem with these kind of instrumental practices by artists in residence is that those that their practice is operated and they're run by people who live outside of the estate. So they can often seem patronising, and even at their best can kind of reinforce dominant estate discourse where residents are others who are kind of incapable of making change for themselves. They need intervention by outsiders in order to function better according to those outsiders' points of view. So I think that is the reason why you often hear stories of estate residents meeting visiting artists with suspicion or refusing to participate in instrumental arts activities. So this is a newsletter sent by the collective Performance Space, and they were forced to leave the car park of a popular housing estate during the development of their performance art faction project. So I don't have time to go into the details of this project and its issues here. You can find this letter online, but I just wanted to use this example to point out that well-meaning, even well-thought-through, well-funded projects can be caught up in these tensions between estate residents and outsiders, and that coming into an estate as an artist is not necessarily a process through which you're seen as benevolently sharing your expertise. Exchanges between artists and outsiders are often fraught and difficult to navigate. And this is sometimes because the visiting artist is like yet another outsider who threatens to limit the voices of estate residents in part. So perhaps because of this kind of fraught public discourse over the past decade where estate residents have been marginalised, estate residents have increasingly fought to have their voices included in public debate. So academics from working class backgrounds, such as Lisa Mackenzie, Beverly Skeggs and Imogen Tyler, have written accounts of the working class experience that counter dominant discourse. And protesters, activists, popular writers and cultural figures have attempted to portray their experience of living or growing up on estates in order to show those estates differently. So the writer Caitlin Moran's recent series Raised by Walls, she says she sought to portray estate residents in a new light, where they were curious and intellectual rather than simply lacking. Meanwhile, the Focus E15's group, Occupation of a Disused Flat on the Carpenters Estate in Newham to protest the loss of social housing in that borough, garnered particular public attention and gave these women a platform to articulate how austerity cuts and the rampant sale of social housing for profit had affected them. But one area that has not received significant academic or public attention is that of residents who are artists or who identify as artists making work on their own estates, about those estates or with their resident neighbours. So it's difficult to map, it's been difficult for me to map, because that hasn't really been what my project's about, how common this phenomenon is, but in the course of my research I've come across a number of estate residents who consider themselves artists, who are paid as artists, that's their primary income, and who use their estate as a space in which they practice. So this is an act of both convenience and a political statement. So artist and academic Lynn McCarthy talks about the political motivation when she discusses her installation that she displayed in her home as part of the Market Estate project. So McCarthy said that she was using her practice as an assertion of a firmly held belief about representation and the power representations have to produce space and the way that we think about spaces. So as an artist, she was keen to confront the traditional barrier between creative practitioner and representative subject. She wanted to represent herself. So she says that she marked a theatrical invention into her own performativity rather than allow the fetishisation of her home by someone else. Another artist who works on estates, and who's just there, is Jordan Mackenzie, who works with visual arts, performance and social practice in a variety of settings. So his subversive works on his own estate play with popular stereotypes circulated in dominant estate discourse, and works subversively to position the council estate as this playful site of joy and creativity. So his work demonstrates the vital role that estate artists can play in challenging dominant discourse and engaging other residents in arts practice. So this work that's up here is called Border Control. So Border Control is a visual artwork that comprises a set of found objects curated and displayed by Mackenzie as photographic images in life size. So he comments directly on the relationship between those inside and outside of the estate when he writes about his motivations for this project. So he says, "The back door space in my block of flats is seen as a tense crossing space by my neighbours where the inside meets the outside. Gangs, individuals, addicts and dealers use the corridors and stairwell and in order to gain access use a multitude of found objects as door stoppers. Over 2 years I retrieved the objects wedged in the door, putting myself in the uneasy position of becoming a guardian of the border." So I think this name Border Control also indicates how some of the debates that underpin insider-outsider tensions surrounding notions of immigration and belonging, who's got the right to live in this country and benefit from things like social housing, kind of are also wrapped up in this project. So kind of the bright colours and incongruous objects transformed the imagined state from a site which is one of only kind of poverty and crime to one of kind of potential intrigue and possibility. It's also really interesting to me that in this project it's the outsiders who are the threat to residents rather than the residents who are the threat to outsiders, which is kind of the way that it normally operates. So I want to come back to this idea of the hood that's been really kind of important in me conceptualising the way that artworks on estates function. So Chris Richardson and Hans Scott Meyer, who are the academics that developed this idea of the global hood, which is the one that I discussed just a minute ago, where North American conceptions of the inner city are appropriated globally, argue that the concept of the hood can be both liberating and limiting. So Bell Hooks has said that to inhabit the margins is to be located in both a place of oppression and a place of resistance. So although it's easy to sort of think about the hood as a damaging, stigmatising narrative for sort of poor working classes and for council estate residents, and certainly in the popular media this idea of kind of gangs and ghettos being appropriated from American hip-hop, that is the normal way that you hear kind of hood appropriation spoken about, I'm interested in thinking about how conceptualising the council estate as part of a global hood, so as part of a global series of connected spaces, allows us to understand ostensibly local, community-based work as part of a network of global resistance. So it's important for me to think about how local work by artists, feed into what Richardson and Scott Meyer called the cultural politics of the global hood, where resistance might happen because networks of self-production are no longer constrained by the axiomatic discipline of the dominant media, the state or the market. So for Richardson and Scott Meyer, it's work that takes place within the bounded space of the hood itself, which has the most potential to resist those dominant stigmatising conceptions of marginalised hood spaces. So using Richardson and Scott Meyer's conception of the global hood, I've developed this model of hood appropriation, which is a method which I've used to think about the ways in which estate residents represent their homes in a variety of spaces, and specifically to think through the relationship between these representations and dominant estate discourse, and then to kind of widen that out to think about how that might operate more as part of this global discourse. So I've come up with this model. So within my model you have the reductive, the subversive, the celebratory and the resistant. So reductive representations tend to draw on stereotypes of the urban inner city to position work as edgy or to appeal to popular culture. So these often rely on stereotypes of gang, violence, crime to fuel the drama, and they're kind of quite cynical, uncritical appropriations that reinforce stigmatising narratives, and usually reductive models come out of kind of real commercial enterprises. So for example, Nike using the hip hop to advertise their trainers. So subversive works work deliberately against reductive stereotypes and undermine spectator expectations of estate space that might be influenced by reductive hood stereotypes. Celebratory representations, however, capitalise on the liberating element of hood culture. So in celebratory representations, what we have is this celebration of this spirit of survival and resistance, and they can often look quite reductive, so they can often look like the reductive model, in that they might reinforce stereotypes, but I think that because they're for the people on the estate, they're more about collectivity rather than commercial gain. And then resistant examples is kind of a nuanced use of hood conventions in order to facilitate a critique of reductive culture, and again capitalising on this liberating spirit of the hood. So these illustrate kind of these resistant examples illustrate a kind of quite a complex cultural politics, again where there's real resistance against the forces of control and domination. So I'm going to just kind of illustrate this model now by going through some examples to sort of talk to each one. So the reductive model. Reductive estate representations, as I say, are often about commercial gain, so they're often conditioned and controlled by institutions. So Off the Ends was a play that was staged by the Royal Court, written by a playwright called Bollock Badgie, who grew up on the North Peckham estate in Peckham, and Peckham, South London, and she wrote a play which she said was about her brother. And the play was about a young black man who came out of prison and went back to live on the estate where he'd grown up with two of his friends who still lived there. He moves back into the estate, into their flat with them, and they're both professionals saving up for a house. But it's set during the credit crunch, and the best friend of David, who's the guy who's come out of prison, loses his job, and David convinces him that he'll make more money if he sells drugs. So they both start selling drugs together, and eventually Kojo, who's David's friend, gets shot by a sort of 10-year-old drug dealer who's angry that Kojo's dealing on his patch. So you have this quite kind of stereotypical representation of a state where you've got these young black men who are engaged in crime, who are sucked, even though they don't want to be sucked back into crime, or sucked back into crime simply by living in their estate environment. And this title, Off the Ends, kind of suggests what the play is saying, that the only way they can get out of this really is to move off of the estate. So I've sort of interviewed Bollock Badgie about this work, and she sort of talks about how it's an attempt to give voice to people who don't normally have their voices heard, to tell a story that comes out of her own experience of estate life. And in a way I completely understand what she's saying. The issue, I think, comes through this being quite a reductive representation, comes through the kind of institutional conditions of its setting. So this is set in the Royal Court, a theatre which is kind of traditionally understood to be attended by a kind of white middle class sort of audience, and whose reviews and so on of this play, which circulate in kind of the broadsheet media, are again received by this audience that is perceived to be kind of white middle class. And the play was directed, and the Royal Court is run by white middle class professionals. So there's a sense to which you can't get away from the kind of institutional conditions of this work, and much of what the pre and the post publicity around Off the Ends said was that this is a true depiction. This must be what it's like on an estate, because the playwright was from an estate and some of the actors were from an estate as well. So the authors of this play were seen to kind of authenticate the stage representation. So the audience were conceived as kind of outsiders that were looking in, being told something about kind of poor working class life that they either already assumed or didn't already know. So in this way, this really still operates within this kind of dominant discipline of the market, whereby you have kind of this product being put on stage as authentic, and therefore it falls into this reductive model. So this is, I'm going to see if I can get this up. Sorry. I'm going to show this video, if I can just go away. Sorry, I've just started using a Mac, so my keyboard shortcut knowledge is now. So this is Jordan Mackenzie's work, Monsieur Poupery Takes a Tour of His Estate. So Monsieur Poupery is an aristocratic character who has fallen on hard times. Oh, it's not there. Okay, stop. Right, I might just have to turn this round. Oh, can I? I'll turn it round and I'll sort of describe it. So Monsieur Poupery is this character who's an aristocratic character who's fallen on hard times and imagines that his council estate is his country manor estate, and he rides a hobby horse around it dressed in riding gear. So we'll just kind of get a little... This is online, so he gallops about his estate on this toy horse, which you'll see in a minute. There it is, that's the one. So he's coming down the lift in the lift, and then he comes out of the lift. And eventually we see, this gives way to him riding around his estate. And there he is. So you see the kind of architecture of the inside of the estate, and then it zooms out to this outside where you've got all of this green space which he rides around. So again, sorry, that's Monsieur Poupery Takes a Tour of His Estate. You can Google that and find it online, because I don't want to show you that whole video because you can't really see it. But the idea really is that what I think it does, it kind of subverts this idea that this estate is this kind of concrete wasteland, which circulates a lot in popular culture, sort of positions it as kind of this green space that has all of this potential, but also it's just quite a joyful, amusing, comic, playful intervention into the estate that kind of subverts these ideas in quite a sweet way, I think. And then I'm not going to be able to show you these, which is a shame, but the celebratory narrative of the estate is what a gang video. So I don't know if you've ever seen gang videos, but gang videos are videos normally made by young black men who affiliate with a gang, and a gang who is on an estate. So this is from the Mountford, the one I was going to show you, but I'm not, because you won't be able to see it properly. It's from the Mountford estate in Hackney, and it has these boys who are dressed in hoodies and kind of bandanas and kind of traditional hood-style clothing, riding around on bikes and rapping about how hard they are and how great their gang is and the estate that they live on, and really kind of celebrating their culture. And what I think is that there are ways in which you can read these as obviously really damaging, dangerous representations of this space, but there's also something in them that really speaks to this idea of liberation and collective identity that Richardson and Scott Meyer talk about as being kind of really essential to the construction of the hood, and the reason why things like hip hop have been so kind of globally appropriated, and why so many people, because it's this way in which these young people can come together and identify not just with each other locally, which they do by the assertion of their gang's name and their estate name and so on, but also with kind of global, poor, racially and economically marginalised people who are living in similar conditions globally. So I will call that a celebratory narrative. And then Spid Theatre Company. So Spid Theatre Company are the example that I'm using at the moment for my resistant practice. And it's a kind of a little bit of a difficult example because Spid Theatre Company are kind of ostensibly an instrumental company. So it is run, the artistic director who founded the company and who still works on it is not a resident who lives on the estate. However, they have been based on the estate for now 10 or 11 years. They occupy the community rooms on the estate. And they work very, very closely with estate residents to conceive their projects, to write their projects and to perform them. And they have a youth theatre company who performed this play in 2008 called 23176. And 23176 again was conceived by the young people and devised by the young people with the help of these of the paid members of the company. And that title 23176, it was later revived and called The Passerby, refers to the number of sexual assaults recorded in the UK in I think 2007. And what happens in 23176 is that it begins with the young people at a bus stop. So you walk into the community rooms and there's a real London bus stop there, which is quite interesting because you just walk past a bus stop outside and then you come into this recreated one. So you get this sense that you're on this real estate, and there's this real bus stop there, which is also a representation of a bus stop. And these young, mostly black boys, there is one white girl in the gang as well, are sort of being very kind of aggressive towards each other, shouting and screaming, behaving like you might see young kids behave at a bus stop. Meanwhile, this is happening. There are screens placed around the community rooms, and in those screens is the inside of a flat where there are two women talking about how scared they are to go outside because they're scared of this gang. Later on in the play, you see one of the women from the flat in a terrible state, and the young people are surrounding her, and it turns out she's been sexually assaulted, and you initially think by these young boys, but what the young boys are actually doing is kind of helping her out. And this is kind of based on the story of the Good Samaritan loosely. And even though this is quite a kind of clunky plot device, it's also sort of really interestingly plays with the audience's expectations of what's going to be represented and of this relationship between reality and representation. And at another point, it does this quite interestingly by kind of, there's another point on the screen at which the young people who are playing the gang in the play are shown as themselves in a kind of recreation of what looks like one of these Channel 4 documentaries. And they're saying to the camera, you know, the media thinks just because I'm young and I'm black and I live on an estate, I'm going to rob somebody or I'm going to rape somebody, but really I want to be a doctor, or, you know. And again, these are quite kind of clunky, simple devices, but what they do is allow these young people to kind of think through the ways in which they're represented and play with this audience's expectation. In a different performance called 16, what Spid Theatre Company did was have, hanging about outside the estate, they had these child actors, and so when people came in, so a lot of their audiences are people from outside of the estate, arts practitioners, kind of people, so on and so forth. They had these young gang members kind of shouting abuse at these people, and I heard anecdotally from a few people that they actually left and didn't go into the performance because they felt really intimidated. When you did go in, it became clear that these young people were part of the performance collective, and actually this was all kind of a representation of what some people might expect to happen on an estate. So what they're really doing is, I think, exemplifying some of the ways in which kind of the playing between the real and the represented can provide a moment of critique for audiences. So what Spid Theatre Company I think do really well is open up moments that audiences within the viewing process can kind of question the perceptions that surround estates and think about how closely they really are related to reality. So I've called in some of my writing that I've done, I've written quite a lot about SPID, I've called their work a kind of spatial critique. So because it's happening on the estate, it allows that work to have a particular potency that actually I think if it was performed elsewhere it wouldn't have. So I'm saying that these kind of performances operate as kind of a critical resistance against the dominant narratives of the council estate that threaten to otherwise subsume residents' identity making. So there's something in the process of this as well that allows the young people living on and around that estate to become aware of the way in which their identities are mediated and kind of resist that. So I think, therefore SPID's work has the potential to function as kind of a strategy for resisting dominant socio-political forces. So that's sort of the examples that I wanted to show you, and what I've really hoped to demonstrate through this talk is an overview of some of these key ideas from my research. So primarily I wanted to kind of try and convince you that this construction of the generic council estate can be and is often dangerously reductive and operates to shore up existing inequalities, and also I think to offer excuses for the government to make really kind of draconian cuts to welfare benefits in social housing and pump money kind of into the private market in a way that's quite unuseful. And I think as well, that these representations can limit the lives and opportunities of some of the most disenfranchised residents on estates. So what I also hope is that I've given you an idea of some of the richness of estates themselves and the exciting ways in which residents respond artistically in different ways to the conditions of their environments. So what I really want to do is to kind of move this into a discussion now, and kind of I'm happy to answer questions, expand on anything I've said, or to hear responses, or to hear about your own work and your own experiences of estate environments. Thank you.